Hello, and welcome to this afternoon's National Principals Month webinar on Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice from Theory. On behalf of NAESP, we would like to thank all of you in our audience who are coming in as principals. We so appreciate everything you do to make our schools and students a wonderful place. My name is Honor Feedy, and I'm the Professional Learning Coordinator here at NAESP, and I'll be supporting our webinar and our speaker today. I'd like to welcome our speaker for this afternoon's session, Dr. Peter DeWitt. Peter is a former K-5 teacher and principal for 8 years. He runs workshops and keynotes nationally and internationally, focusing on leadership, coaching, and fostering inclusive school climates. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today and sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you for having me. All right, so we're gonna get started. I know people are going to be coming on as I'm presenting through the information. Thank you very much for taking your time to spend some time with me. I know that you are all very, very busy. So happy National Principals Month, really important month. As Honor said, I was a teacher for 11 years and a school principal for 8 years. The years that I was a principal in one school district were some of the best of my life. So I'm always honored to work with principals. Much of my work focuses on instructional leadership, and not only do I run workshops or competency-based courses, but I also coach school leaders, middle school and high school principals, as well as elementary school principals in California 1 week a month. So a lot of this work that you're going to see is actually brand new work for me. It is from a book that is coming out with Corwin Press in January called Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice from Theory. And there were several reasons why I wanted to touch on the topic. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Collaborative Leadership, 6 Influences That Matter Most, and I talked about how we can do a better job of working with our school community. One of the influences that I talked about, and those 6 influences were based on the work of John Hattie, somebody I'll talk about in a little while. One of those influences was instructional leadership. And I used to pride myself on being an instructional leader when I was a school principal, went to classrooms every day, had lots of discussions with teachers about learning and flipped faculty meetings, all of those kind of things. But what I realized after I wrote the book is that not everybody has the opportunity to be an instructional leader. Something else I will get into in our short time together. So a lot of school districts, a lot of school boards in Canada, and then other places internationally have asked me to start focusing more on instructional leadership. And it was actually because most of my work is, about 85% of my work is repeat work. I wanted to keep diving deeper and deeper. I wanted to look at instructional leadership, not just from the research side, through other researchers who I will mention, and research that I've been doing as well over the past few years, but also wanted to focus on the practical lens, because what I worry about sometimes is that there are researchers that talk about how we should be instructional leaders, but some of those researchers have actually never been a school principal. They don't understand the complexities of the position. So that's something I'm going to get into. Just a couple of things for your knowledge. You have the chat session. Please use it, because that is going to be our primary way of communicating during this hour together. So if you have any questions, please make sure you put them in the all panelists and attendees box. So when it says 2, there are several different options for you. There's all panelists and attendees, and then there's NAESP. Please do the all panelists and attendees, and you can pop your question in there, and I'm going to pay attention to those as we go on. So hopefully this gave time for people who have registered and will be coming in. I know other people will be watching the recording, because Honor and NAESP are recording this webinar as well. So whether you're watching me virtually live or if you're watching this as a recorded webinar, thank you very much for taking the opportunity to join me. So John Hattie is somebody I've worked with over the past five and a half years. John's out of the University of Melbourne in Australia. He's done the largest meta-analysis of what works in education. He synthesizes meta-analysis together. So one of the things that I've been keen to in John's research for the past few years is the fact that he looked at overall school leadership. And in John's work, and many researchers actually agreed on this, it's not just John, is that a 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth for a year's input. So when I was looking over John's research on it, there were 17 meta-analysis that he has synthesized. That's 600 studies on school leadership alone. And when you look at that, the average effect size was a 0.37. That was always very interesting to me because as a school principal, I want to know that our impact is greater than that. I want to know that it's going to be over a 0.40. So when you look at the moderators of the research that John has synthesized and collected, you will look at things like transformational leadership or instructional leadership. And in the research on just instructional leadership, it actually has a 0.42 effect size. And that's why I think that's a place that we need to be able to spend our time. What's interesting though, is although I found the time to be able to be an instructional leader not 24/7, it was an hour there, an hour here. What I found by coaching leaders, middle school, high school, and those elementary school principals as well, I found that they didn't always have the opportunity to be instructional leaders. And then other times, what I found is that there are a lot of assistant principals that became principals, but when they were in the AP role, they had never been allowed to get into classrooms. They'd spent their time doing discipline. So what that meant is that we're creating the cycle or continuing the cycle where the APs became principals, but they weren't sure how to practice instructional leadership. So in fact, when I started to write this book in January, and it'll be out in January of 2020, when I started doing the research around instructional leadership and started scouring through what's out there by people like Vivian Robinson, Ken Leithwood, and then started to do my own research as well, I found that instructional leadership is one of the most researched forms of school leadership over the past 50 years. But many of the researchers said, we're not quite sure what has a direct impact on student learning. They call instructional leadership the black box of school leadership because they're not always sure what goes into it. And that's what I started to break down. Now I have a luxury. I do this work both in workshops and competency-based courses. I can write about it for my blog for Education Week called Finding Common Ground. And so I have lots of opportunities besides coaching that I can talk about this work and kind of go through it with people who are in your position that we can talk about. And many of them are very honest to be able to say, I'd love to do that, but I can't do that, or I don't have time to do that. So this first slide is really my definition of instructional leadership. And the reason why I put it up here is not be obnoxiously arrogant or anything like that. But the reality is a lot of the research around instructional leadership focuses on just building-based leadership. And I think it's actually more than that. So instructional leadership is when those in a leadership position can work on things like implementation of practices. And the reason why I say those in a leadership position is because over the past 5.5 years that I've been working as a consultant and author, it is not just building or district leaders that show up to my workshops or that I've worked with in competency-based courses or coaching. The reality is there are instructional coaches that come because I used to train instructional coaches for Jim Knight. And then, of course, over the past couple of years, you've had this insurgence of teacher leaders, and that teacher leader position is very important. What I found in my time both working as a principal but also running workshops and doing research is that credibility piece, when we talk about instructional leadership, what it often needs to come with is that of credibility. And if we don't have credibility in our role, then anytime that we go in to give feedback or something like that, it could fall flat because the teachers on the receiving end of our feedback or the students on the receiving end of our feedback may look at us as though we are not a credible source. Where that comes from is the work of Stone and Heen. Stone and Heen are Harvard professors who wrote a fantastic book called Thanks for the Feedback. And they talked about feedback triggers. And what they studied was not necessarily the feedback we give, but how we receive feedback, which is a fascinating topic. And what Stone and Heen say is that there are actually 3 feedback triggers. The first one is the truth trigger. When we receive feedback, we find that the feedback is unhelpful or untrue. They call that the truth trigger. The second one is the identity trigger. That goes off when the feedback we're receiving shatters the identity we set for ourselves. We might think that we're these amazing instructional leaders, but when we serve our staff, they say, we don't think you're an instructional leader. It shatters the identity that we set for ourselves. The third one, and the one that is very supportive of everything that I'm doing, is actually called the relationship trigger. The relationship trigger goes off when the feedback we receive isn't set off by whether it's true or untrue, but it's actually set off by the particular person. We don't find that person to be a credible source to give us feedback. So say, for example, Honor from an ASP is actually one of my teachers, and I give her feedback, but I never taught fourth grade, and that's what Honor happens to be teaching. Maybe I was a high school teacher. Honor may or may not say to me, you don't have the credibility to give me that kind of feedback because you never taught fourth grade. Instructional coaches get this quite a bit because a lot of instructional coaches were taken out of a teaching role after maybe 4 or 5 years, and they're responsible for going in to give feedback to a teacher who's been teaching for 25, 30 years. And they're at risk of hearing, you don't have the credibility to give me that feedback because you didn't teach long enough. So that credibility factor is really central to our feedback. It's really central to how we lead. So there are a few things here. I did a survey, and I want you to take a look at the survey, but I wrote a blog on instructional leadership. And when I was doing the blog on instructional leadership, I actually put a survey monkey at the end. And in the survey monkey, they had about 8 to 10 questions. And one of the things that I asked was, I'm confident I'm an instructional leader. So I'm going to give you a moment just to look at this, and I'm going to take a drink of my tea.
And also, Peter, in the meantime, can you also give us the authors for that? Thanks for the
Yeah,
feedback.
I see that Katie is asking for the authors of that work. So I just write, oh, thank you, Heath Piney. I didn't realize Heath and Katie were going to be a part of this. So you're right, Stone and Heen, you beat me to it. I put Stone of Heen, though. So Heath, so thank you very much for helping me out. When I was doing the research and I had put questions about, I'm confident I'm an instructional leader, you can see that 24% said very confident, 43% said confident. And you can see that 8% said I'm not confident at all that I'm an instructional leader. And I remember working with the French-speaking schools in Toronto, and one of them came up to me, one of the principals came up to me and said, I'm one of your 8%. And I asked him why he didn't feel confident. And he said, no, I'm literally one of your 8%. I filled out your survey. And I thought that was kind of remarkable because I've spoken to him so many times and I felt like he was confident. And he said, I just don't always feel confident going into somebody's classroom, especially in classrooms with content that I didn't teach. So this and go a little bit further with it. And I wrote another blog and I put a survey, but I sent it out to teachers. Once again, they had the definition of instructional leadership. And they had the same question, only it was, I'm confident my principal is an instructional leader. And you can see that the numbers around very confident and confident went down, but somewhat and not confident at all went up. Now, I wrote about this in a follow-up blog, but the reality is, and there were some principals that got really upset with me when I wrote it, I wasn't trying to make a separation between principals and teachers. What I think this has a great deal to do with is proximity. I think that, so I see that Katie and Heath are a part of this. We'll say Heath is a teacher of mine, and he and I have a really good relationship, and I'm in his classroom all the time. Well, if he fills out a survey and it says, I'm confident my principal is an instructional leader, then he's going to say, yeah, very confident Peter's an instructional leader because we talk about teaching all the time. But say Katie is a teacher, or my friend Tara No, who's in here as well. Say they're both teachers that teach with their door closed, and I don't like to go into a classroom where a door is closed, so I continually walk by. Well, when they fill out the survey, because they don't see me as often, they may say, no, I'm not confident at all, or I'm somewhat confident that Peter's an instructional leader, but I really don't see him that much. I think this has a lot to do with proximity. How do we practice instructional leadership in those times that we have greatest access to our teachers? How do we practice instructional leadership during things like faculty meetings or our formal observations, or even those pesky walkthroughs that people do all the time, but I don't see that I don't see that the walkthroughs always have the biggest bang for their buck. So I'm getting a question here, and I'm going to stop for a question before I move in. Tara said, thank you for pointing out the instructional coach principal connection. My former principal and I were always a unit. We had to be on the same page and share the common mission. We also had to process our receive feedback collaboratively. I am working out how I can support and connect with multiple principals now that I am a district level coach of teachers. Any tips? I think, Tara, like anything, it's in the relationships you build. It's once again what I talked about earlier, which is the credibility thing. How do you present yourself in a way with those principals that you can actually make them feel confident that you are an instructional leader as well, that you can actually help not only make their job easier, but how can you actually make their job more rich by working with you? Sometimes it's in the email that you're sending, or you're asking them for a one-on-one conversation where you can meet up with them and share ideas with them. Those are ways that you can do it. Other ways that I started to do with my teachers is I would send out maybe a blog that, not that I wrote, because back then I wasn't writing a blog, but it might be the articles that I share with them. There are lots of ways that we can build credibility. But the other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that you are new in that position, and that also takes time. So it is something that you feel a sense of urgency to do, but those principals might not feel that same sense of urgency. So start looking at it from a grassroots effort. Who are the principals that you can meet up with to start building that trust with, so you can show them your instructional leadership? As we move on, and this might help any of the questions that are coming my way, and I'll do my best to balance both, knowing that we have less than an hour together. One of the things that I started to be conscious of is researchers that were saying it's like a black box. How do we break down instructional leadership? What does it look like? So what I started to do is research and try to break instructional leadership down to what it looks like, because I have a really great opportunity here. I have the opportunity to have that background as an instructional leader from when I was a school principal. I work with researchers, but I also spend almost every week on the road where I'm working with leaders, both in workshops or coaching, where we can have these discussions about where do we need to spend our time. If we're going to build credibility in our role, where can we authentically start spending our time? And this is where these 6 came up. So I'm going to go through each one of them, albeit quickly, because like I said, it's coming out in a longer book, in January, and it's something that I present workshops on now anyway. But there's implementation, there's a focus on learning, there's student engagement, instructional strategies, efficacy, and notice how it's not just self-efficacy or collective efficacy, it's just efficacy, and then impact. How can we understand our point of impact? So this is what I would like you to do as I take a sip of tea. I would like you to look at this framework, and in your position, as you're sitting here joining me, out of all of these, which ones do you feel that you have the greatest confidence in? Is it implementation? Is it instructional strategies? Is it student engagement? Or is it efficacy? And where is one place where you actually don't have that sense of confidence? Many times it's the first one we're going to go through, which is implementation, but just take a minute to look at these, and then I'm going to read some of the questions. So as you're looking through, I'm hoping that I'm saying the name correctly, Chansey. But Chansey talked about how They use leadership implementation teams. Groups of principals meet monthly to share strategies and supports with each other. That's awesome. What I want you to pay attention to, Chancey, then, I mean, besides all of the webinar, I'd love you to pay attention to all of it. But when we get to that efficacy part, I'm going to talk a little bit about collective leader efficacy, and I want to know your thoughts on that as we go through. And I also just want to tell everybody that at the end of this webinar, there is actually a link to some research that I am doing on school leadership teams. So Chancey, you would be doing me a great benefit if you took the time to fill that. I'll explain more about that later. So often this is how implementation looks, right? I've heard many people use the phrase build the plane while flying. I've had other people just say we figure it out as we go along, all of that kind of stuff. It shouldn't always be that way. Implementation is something that has been researched a lot. Michael Fullen is somebody that looked at implementation dips. And even on those greatest implementations, when everybody's on board, and I know some of you are saying, when does that happen? But even on those implementations where everybody's on board, there are times you go through, and it's usually winter when things are gray or something like that, when people are tired, where we're at risk of the implementation dip. And we're actually at risk of even more than that. We're at risk of actually losing the whole implementation because something pushes back and we go on a cognitive conflict and our implementation breaks apart. So, so implementation is something that is really important. And one of the things I was introduced to, and I created my own, is called a program logic model. So in a program logic model, what you can see above you, or see in front of you, sorry, on the above, are things like needs, inputs, activities, outputs, and then impact. And Tara, I see your question. Measuring impact is so important. I'm interested to know what tools are you using? And when Tara writes that question, especially when we get to impact at the end, she's not just looking for an answer from me, she's actually looking for insight from all of you. So this would be a great place to share some of that. So when we're looking at implementation, very often we don't do a program logic model. And program logic models are really important because they help us break down to our necessary parts to really feel like and really look and say, have we thought about this implementation enough? Are we doing it because it's filling a need? Or are we doing it because of the fact that we saw it on social media and it needs to be done? So when we look at needs, it's what is our current reality? Where do we want to improve? And what does our evidence show us? When you're looking at the program logic model, it's really important to be able to understand what is your area of need that you're trying to fill. Under inputs, it's the resources necessary to meet your goal, things like research-based articles or even sharing best practices. Or when I used to train instructional coaches for Gym Night, I would use videos from the teaching channel of Gym Night in action. These are resources necessary to meet your goal. Things like time. I always ask people to put time down because it's a definite factor. In the program logic model, the next piece you have to look at are what are the activities that are going to help me meet our goal. One of the things that I found by coaching leaders and working with leaders is this idea that they do a lot of activities, but they're not always quite sure why they're doing them. In this case, with a program logic model, I wanted activities to be directly tied to the needs. What activities are you going to do that will help you meet your need? And then outputs is actually when are you going to begin taking actionable steps? Because the research around change shows we stay in the pre-contemplative state of change quite often. So what I'm saying is that you need to put a timestamp on those activities. How will you begin taking actionable steps? Say, for example, an activity that I'm looking at is a flipped faculty meeting. I might say in the output stage, in October, I'm going to begin flipping the faculty meetings. And lastly, the most important is the impact. How are teachers and students going to benefit? Because if they're not going to benefit from these activities and what we think are our needs, then why are we doing them? This is what I would like you to do, because I see a question by Michael up on the screen that I'd like to answer, but I want to give you a moment to look at the program logic model. And this is what I would like you to think. And I know this is going to be brief, so it's really about sketching it out. Think of a need that you have in your position. Be very, very selfish. Don't think about the building. Don't think about the district. Don't think about anybody else, but think about your position right now. Be very selfish. And think about what is an area of need you have. And then start sketching out what are some resources that would help you meet your need. What are some activities that would help meet that need? Take a minute to do that. I'm going to read Michael's question. I'll come back with an answer, and then we'll move on. You have about 1 minute. Okay, so trying to pay attention and do two jobs at the same time. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking you're seeing the program logic model for the first time. I can guarantee you if you do a Google search, you will have seen program logic models before. Many of them are very complicated. I wanted to make this as simple as possible. Now, Michael asked a fantastic question, and actually, Michael, I used that quotation in the book on instructional leadership, and Michael Fullen actually gave me a testimonial for the book. Michael's been very supportive of me over the years. So it's a great question. What Michael asks is, Michael Fullen says in his book, The Principal, that the role of principal as instructional leaders is too narrow a focus. Principals are more education leaders, and instructional leadership is a slice of the whole pie. What is your perspective on this? I completely agree for a couple of different reasons. So let me explain. When I wrote Collaborative Leadership in 2016, it was in part based on what Michael's perception was, or Michael's research was from the principal. I wanted to look at collaborative leader and say, you know what, instructional leadership is a piece of our pie, but also, you know, so are things about giving feedback or understanding assessment capable learners or understanding how to engage the greater community, whether that means families or businesses, whatever. So for me, collaborative leadership was always this sort of big umbrella, and instructional leadership was one piece. I further agree with this because many times when I'm working, whether it's nationally or internationally, there are principals that will come to me and say, I don't have time to be an instructional leader. I have the management side I'm supposed to be doing, something else that Michael Fullen says. And I totally agree with this. The reason why I'm breaking it down this much is because I want principals to understand that when they are able to take that hour or 2 hours or whatever time to focus on instructional leadership, which I am tying to their credibility as well, because think about it this way, Michael. They are responsible for providing feedback to teachers, especially formal observation feedback. If they don't have the credibility, then when they provide that feedback for that professional observation or that formal observation, there's a chance they're wasting their time and that of the teacher. So even though instructional leadership is a small slice of the whole pie, which I agree with, it is really important that we understand what makes up instructional leadership so we're very clear about what that looks like. So I hope that answered your question, because I do agree with what Michael's saying, but I think what I needed to do, and this is what I said in the book, I needed to take Michael's thought and I needed to further it and say, if instructional leadership is indeed a piece of a larger pie, then let's get that little piece of the pie somewhat straight, because we don't many times have that straight. And when we're doing things like walkthroughs or, you know, just walkthroughs alone, or when I work with leaders on PLCs, they don't know always what questions to ask in that space that's supposed to be focused on learning. I'll explain more about that as we go along. Now, here's an example, and I know some of you are probably going to be looking at this saying, why didn't he give us the example in the first place? But I wanted you to be selfish and kind of look at a program logic model under your own idea. What I did here, and it's really important because one of the things that I find in the research I have done on school climate, because I wrote a book on school climate, and the research around instructional leadership, one of actually the things that inspired me to start focusing on instructional leadership so much is that we often have a common language, but we don't have a common understanding. So say, for example, Michael is one of my teachers. And I say to Michael, I'm coming in to do my walkthroughs, and I am going to be focusing on student engagement. And Michael's thinking, hey, that's awesome. I love student engagement. In fact, my kids, I believe in authentic engagement where the kids are up and moving, and they're going to be doing most of the talking. So when DeWitt comes in, it's going to be awesome. But what Michael doesn't realize is that my idea of student engagement is compliant engagement. So when I go into Michael's classroom, I want to see the kids sitting down, and I want to hear Michael teaching because that's what I pay him for. And in fact, I had a principal say that to me one time when I was a teacher. Now we're talking about student engagement, but we have two very different ideas about what student engagement actually stands for. Mine is compliant engagement. Michael's is authentic engagement. So what we have to look at is the fact that we often have a common language, but we don't have a common understanding. So as you can see, I even wrote down things like the growth mindset. If everybody really truly understood what the growth mindset was, Carol Dweck wouldn't have had to revisit that 2 years ago in Education Week. If we really did understand what differentiated instruction is, Carol Ann Tomlinson wouldn't have had to write about that in Education Week 3 years ago. If we really did understand what multiple intelligences is, then Howard Gardner wouldn't have had to revisit that 3 or 4 years ago in the Washington Post. Inputs, time, research-based articles, models of successful practice. What are activities that are going to help us with our whole idea of student engagement? Those are things like walkthroughs, flipped faculty meetings, where we send out information about student engagement ahead of time, 3 days before a faculty meeting, and give teachers an opportunity to read it and then actually talk about it at the faculty meeting. PLC protocols. There are many, many times that I'm working with leaders just on PLCs alone. And what they find is they have the time and space for them, but the dialogue that happens to them are not always authentic. Outputs, you can see the outputs. Principals going to focus on student engagement in their learning walks. You saw the idea about flipped faculty meetings. And then you can see under impact, it says a common language and a common understanding is one of the most important elements to positive school climate. So what I'm really asking you to do in a program logic model is take this, when you're thinking about, I want to implement something that's going to be important, it's going to have an important impact on teachers, and I want you to create something that looks like this. I want you to think about, and you don't do this alone. In fact, program logic models, really easy to do alone, harder to do with people because of the conversations that we have and that it's going to inspire. But what I would love for you to do is look at this program logic model and start thinking about the necessary steps and start thinking about why is it that you're doing what you're doing. This is something that I've been working with on schools and regionals, districts, and even a state right now, and it seems to be working very, very well. So implementation is key. We don't spend enough time talking about it. A program logic model is a good start. Now, I've talked a little bit about walkthroughs before, and one of the reasons why I focus so much on walkthroughs, a few years ago I wrote a blog for Finding Common Ground called The 8 Myths of Walkthroughs, because I started to see that walkthroughs were done very different depending on the building or the district, and that teachers often felt that walkthroughs were being done to them and not done with them because of feedback and all that kind of stuff. So when I started working with principals to say, what do you look for when you're doing walkthroughs, what I started to see is that we have a walkthrough bias. We go in to do a walkthrough in a classroom, and many times we look for the classroom to look and feel like our classrooms look like when we were teachers. So I started thinking about the walkthrough bias and understanding our biases when we go into classrooms and those non-negotiables and those things that we need to be open to. But when I started to talk with principals, a lot of what we talked about is the idea of that the kids are working in groups. But when I asked for deeper conversations on that, they weren't always there. It was like we know what a classroom's supposed to look like, but we're not always completely sure about what kind of conversations are supposed to be happening in there. So in collaborative leadership, I looked at things like solo taxonomy, which was sort of the precursor to the depths of knowledge. What I wanted to look at in this case was that I wanted to give principals and instructional coaches and teacher leaders something tangible. When I walk into classrooms, this is maybe what I could be hearing. These are the questions that I should be hearing between teachers and students. These are the questions that I could be asking in my role as the observer going in to talk with students. And it comes down to Bloom's revised taxonomy. Anderson started to look at this. So cognitive process dimensions, the knowledge dimensions. So there are 4 of them. And factual knowledge, you can see, you've probably read this already. Factual knowledge, isolated bits of information. Conceptual knowledge, it's about conceptualizing what you're learning and understanding why, if it means something here, does it mean something here as well? It's looking at categories and those kind of things. Then we've got procedural knowledge, the knowledge of skills. And then, of course, we've got metacognitive knowledge. What sort of reflection are we doing with evidence as students, as learners, even as teachers? So it's really important to kind of keep all of this in mind when we're going into classrooms. Do we look for the knowledge dimensions? So I'm going to give you some examples. You can see factual knowledge, things like when was JFK assassinated, or something I just talked about earlier. What does a 0.40 effect size mean in Hattie's research? But when it comes to conceptual knowledge, there is a researcher who I like very much. Her name is Julie Stern, S-T-E-R-N. She's written some really great conceptual understanding books for Corwin. And one of the questions I got from her, which was great, is what is the relationship between? So the question I wrote is, what is the relationship between the research around school leadership and what you experience in your school? Thank you for writing that on her, Julie Stern. Procedural knowledge, what is your understanding of the order of operations? Not just do you know the order of operations, but do you understand how to put them in place? And of course, there's a metacognitive knowledge. What did I learn today that challenged my thinking? But also, John Hattie's research shows us that creating an outline before writing a paper has 0.75 effect size. So when I look at the knowledge dimensions, when I look at a focus on learning, because I want to backtrack a little bit. So Michael talked to me a little bit about Michael Fullen saying instructional leadership is a slice of the pie. When we look at instructional leadership and we start to go in for that targeted view on instructional leadership, I looked at credibility. Does an instructional coach, a teacher leader, a principal, do they have credibility in their role as an instructional leader? Where do they talk about learning? Then it trickles down to implementation. When we implement something, is it based on what we saw on Twitter? Or is it based on the idea that this is fitting a real need for us? So then when we go to that implementation stage and do that program logic model, which is really important, and in the book, I have an implementation cycle, but we don't have time to get into it here. It's how do we slow down that implementation cycle? Because too often it's create a goal, learn from each other, and implement. It just doesn't work that easily because of what we know about self-efficacy. So it's how do we slow down that process of implementation to really make sure we're honing in on what we should be. As an instructional leader, our job is to do formal observations and walkthroughs. It's sort of I would say 99% of the time I'm working with leaders, those are the things that leaders are responsible for, but they don't always feel confident doing it because they don't know what to look for. And that's where the knowledge dimensions come in. Tara now said, am I seeing a connection to the levels of feedback, task process, and self-regulation from John Hattie's research? Absolutely, they're intertwined. But when we're looking at the knowledge dimensions, what's interesting is often when I'm running a workshop, I'll ask principals who just got done telling me that they feel really confident as instructional leaders. I ask them, what one do you see happening the most in classrooms? And this is how it always goes. We see factual knowledge when we go into the classrooms. And then to a lesser extent, we'll see procedural knowledge. And then to an even lesser extent, we'll see conceptual knowledge. And then almost zero out of the past 4 months that I've been running workshops, every week, hundreds of administrators, they say, we don't really see metacognitive knowledge. And when I talk about why do you see factual knowledge, many of them will yell out, it's easy, worksheets. But this is what I wonder. If we're so confident in our instructional leadership, why does that still happen? Why are we not having conversations about these things? And I don't think it's that we don't see metacognitive knowledge happening in classrooms. I don't think we always look for it because it's not on our radar. And that's why I put the knowledge dimensions there. Now, student engagement. There are many different ways we can go with student engagement. So this is the slide that sort of captures both. Because if we're talking about instructional leadership with a focus on learning, we need to understand the social emotional side and the academic side. And then when we are implementing something, we need to understand both of those. And then when we look at knowledge dimensions, the knowledge dimensions are important because if we've got students that aren't completely engaged during the procedural knowledge part, is it because they needed the factual knowledge part? So understanding the knowledge dimensions is directly tied to student engagement. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about walkthroughs, about how you go in to do a walkthrough and principals look for cooperative learning. Well, one of the pieces of research that has stood in my mind for the past few years is that of Rob Coe. He's out of the UK. And I know, Katie, you're going to ask me, so his name is up on the screen. Rob Coe's out of the UK, and he's done some really interesting research to say about 80%, or about around 70% of the time students are in our classrooms, they're actually in cooperative learning groups. That's good, right? But 80% of that time, they're actually doing individual work. So we're really good at cooperative seating. We aren't as good at cooperative learning. Now, last week, I was in Kansas and Chicago. And somebody said, is that so wrong? And I said, no, it depends on what the point of the learning is. What is the intention behind the learning? If the intention is to give students time to do something individually, then it's fine that 80% of the time they might be doing individual work. But if the point of the learning is to also build cooperative learning where kids are actually doing reciprocal teaching where they're learning from one another or in groups of 4, then this is a problem, right? So it really comes down to what is it, not only what we're looking for, but what is the point behind the lesson. Now, what's also interesting is John Goodlad, and I'm going to give you 2 pieces of information here. 1990s, you can see what he said. 75% of class time is spent on instruction. Teachers out-talk students 3 to 1 lesson. 1% was associated with open questions. Now, back over the last decade, Janet Clinton, now the University of Melbourne, and yes, Katie, you're keeping me honest. Her name is Janet Clinton, and I don't have her name up there, so I'm typing it in. Janet is out of the University of Melbourne in Australia, and she has done some great research on student talk versus teacher talk. And what she found is on average, teachers ask 200 questions per day. Students ask 2 questions per student per week. So what happens is that your high-achieving students don't mind so much that you're the one talking so much because they can weed out the good information from the bad. Your struggling learners wish you would stop talking so much because they want to hear it from a peer because their peer usually uses it in the language that they can understand. So when we go into classrooms and we want to, in this instructional leadership space, and we start to do those walkthroughs and we start to do formal observations and we're looking around the classroom, what is it we're looking for and what is actually happening in the classroom? What kind of questions can kids answer? Are they factual, procedural, conceptual? Are they metacognitive? Because that's surface to deep to transfer level learning. When we go in and we see teachers talking so much, what's happening with the students in that classroom? So that's the academic side, and there's a lot of other things we can do, and one's going to be instructional strategies, which I'll get into in just a minute. But the other side I told you about is a social emotional side. Now, social emotional, I found some really powerful research that started in the 70s with Odutola. And what they found in their research is that many of our students will feel alienated from school. Whether it's before they graduate or after they graduate, they think they didn't really care about us. And they said that there are 2 reasons why students feel alienated. Number 1 is identification. They don't feel an emotional connection to their teacher or their school community. The second one is they feel powerless. They don't feel like they had a voice in their own learning. That to me is really powerful, because when teachers say they're standing at the doorway, welcoming kids in, getting to know their names, all that kind of stuff, those are really important pieces. But also, the work I did on school climate is, how do we include marginalized populations? How do we use resources that are reflective of the very students we have in our classroom? Those help build that emotional connection to their school community as well. There's so much richness here that I love when it comes to student engagement. Now, one of the other things that we look at are instructional strategies. On that academic side, what sort of instructional strategies are we using when we go into the classroom? And if we're going to spend time in that space of instructional leadership, do we just easily welcome the strategies we see in front of us? Or do we actually talk to teachers about different strategies they use in the classroom that could be really powerful to student learning? I'm going to give you an example. So there are 5 different strategies that Hattie has researched in his research, but you know what I mean. Transfer strategies, classroom discussion techniques, reciprocal teaching, Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry. Anything Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry is awesome, but Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry actually wrote a really great article for ASCD on reciprocal teaching and the jigsaw method. They're both in their column for educational leadership, and they come with videos. Jigsaw method has a 1.20 effect size. This is the thing. That is the highest effect size of any instructional strategy that Hattie has researched. But the thing is that what Doug and Nancy actually say in their column for ASCD is that we often don't do it right. We do it in 3 steps. We get that passage that we're supposed to read, and we read our part, and then we talk about it with the people who read the other parts. And then we go to our expert group, where we talk with the people who read the same thing we did. And then we go back to that original group, where we talk once again what we learned from our expert group, and we tie it into the whole passage that we read and talk about. And that's where Doug and Nancy say we usually stop. What they say is that the research actually shows us that we're supposed to go back to our expert group one more time. And we often don't do that because, 1, we don't know we're supposed to. And number 2, we run out of time. So in this instructional leadership space, what I did in the book is that in the instructional leadership book, I actually took about 10 strategies, high impact strategies, and I broke them down to what they're supposed to look like. And then I applied them to surface, deep, and transfer level learning. And I also rated it to the knowledge dimensions. You're looking at these strategies. It's not just a fun strategy that's going to engage students. It's, are we sure that we're actually using it correctly? Because that one blog by Doug and Nancy where they talked about the jigsaw method is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it, because you think you're doing it correctly, and then you read something like that and find that maybe you don't. Efficacy is one of the last pieces that we'll talk about. And Ken Leithwood is one of my favorite leadership researchers, and actually Ken also gave me a testimonial for this book on instructional leadership, which I'm incredibly thankful for. But one of the things that Ken Leithwood looks at is, he said, motivation. How do we motivate people to get them to want to go deeper with their practices? It's all built into agency. How much of a voice do we feel like we have within our own learning? So take that alienation piece from students and think about it from the adults, especially in New York State, where I used to be a principal and where I reside, or my friend Vicki Day, who's part of the webinar. She's a great principal in the Adirondacks. In New York State, we, for a while, didn't feel like we had a sense of agency because of the accountability and mandates. But what agency breaks down to is those 2 pieces: capacity beliefs, self-efficacy, and context beliefs, which is, do we actually feel like the school or the school district we work in is going to support our need to try to be innovative, or are they going to try to shut us down? So this is just something really important to look at, because what this leads to is that there are actually 4 types of efficacy that we have to pay attention to. Self-efficacy, many of you know, Bandura, the confidence we have in ourselves, right? We know this. And then we've got collective teacher efficacy, which from Bandura to Megan Shannon Moran to many others like Goddard and Hoy have looked at collective teacher efficacy, the confidence we have in our teacher team, because that shows that when a teacher team works together on a goal and they challenge each other's beliefs and they try different strategies in the classroom and then they celebrate the success, and when it has a positive impact on student learning, that's collective teacher efficacy. If it doesn't have a positive impact on student learning, it's not collective efficacy. Now, what's next after that is leadership self-efficacy. Bandura actually says, he studied this in 2000. What he found is that leadership self-efficacy shows that in those areas where we feel efficacious, where we feel confident, we double our efforts as leaders. In those areas where we don't feel confident, we slacken our efforts. So I want to get back to Michael's question. Michael was talking about Michael Fullen and the small piece of the pie. But even though it's a small piece of the pie, it is a huge, huge piece that has impact, because if we don't feel confident in our instructional leadership practices, student engagement, knowledge dimensions, instructional strategies, and then we go in to do walkthroughs and observations, we're going to take the easy way out, and we're going to continue to provide observations that don't have an impact on any teacher learning. I want to show it a different way. I did my doctoral research on how well school administrators safeguard LGBT students. I did it 10 years ago. And what I found is that when there were leaders that felt confident talking about what's deemed a controversial topic, then they were doubling their efforts. They were going to find resources. They were going to provide professional learning and development. Those leaders that didn't feel confident talking about a controversial issue slackened their effort and became more reactive than proactive. What this leads to is collective leader efficacy. And that's where you're going to hopefully help me out. Now, collective leader efficacy is how confident do we feel in our leadership team. This is huge. So there is not enough research to actually provide a meta-analysis around collective leader efficacy. There is when it comes to collective teacher efficacy. There is when it comes to self-efficacy. When it comes to collective leader efficacy, there is just simply not enough research out there. And I think this is a huge space to spend time with. And I want to give you a couple of reasons why. As instructional leaders, we don't know it all. But if we happen to be surrounded by assistant principals or an instructional coach like Tara No, or we have teacher leaders, when we're surrounded by them and they have a deep understanding of instructional practices, then we can learn from them. That is the leadership team that we should be spending time talking with. But this is how many times leadership teams work. I'm the principal, Vicky's my assistant principal, Tara's my assistant principal, Katie's my assistant principal. Katie, Tara, and Vicky all have to do discipline, and I do the other stuff, working with parents, the figurehead stuff, the management stuff. But what happens is that if I never properly prepare and coach Vicky, Tara, and Katie to be instructional leaders, then they will go and take on their own buildings and become principals, and they won't be prepared for the role. Collective leader efficacy is how when we get together as a leadership team, we can work together. The negative side is that when we have principals that work with assistant principals, and a fractured team, everybody on the team has at least one person in the building they get along with really well. So say Katie, Tara, and Vicky don't like me very much, but they are friends with Michael and other people in the building. They will go and say, well, I'd love to do it, but Peter's not letting us. That already shows that there is a fracture in our team, and that can actually fracture our school climate. I know I'm trying to say that quickly, and I hope that makes sense. Collective leader efficacy is incredibly important because how we come together, whether we are principals and assistant principals, superintendent and principals, principal, assistant principals, instructional coaches, and teacher leaders as a leadership team, the work we do there in our leadership team is incredibly important. And many times when I'm looking at that space with the people I coach, we start with common language and common understanding. Just a simple graph that I've created. And what it is it shows that when with collective efficacy, we have how does our leadership team function? What area of student learning do they focus on? What's necessary for collective leader efficacy? Do they have a positive impact on student learning? On the other side, it's do they have a common language, common understanding, a collaborative mindset? How do they challenge each other? If they don't, then they might have a negative impact on student learning. And the other thing, and this is something that I was talking about earlier when we were talking about leadership teams coming together, this is just something very simple. Do we have high impact and high collaboration? Do we have low impact and low collaboration? Or are we somewhere else? High collaboration doesn't mean we meet a lot. It means that when we meet, we're very collaborative, where we challenge each other's thinking. You can have low collaboration and a high impact, but that impact could be a negative impact. So when we're looking at our leadership teams, this is something that's really important to keep in mind. Now I know we only have 3 minutes left. So I want to just switch over to one last thing, which is evidence. Do you collect evidence to understand your impact? What does that evidence look like? And who's involved in the process? Many times people will come to me and say, Peter, we would really like you to give us a list of the evidence to collect. I think it is much more powerful when we get together for a group and say, if this is what we want to learn, what evidence can we collect to help us? So for example, I've been picking on things like faculty meetings and walkthroughs. If we're doing a flipped faculty meeting, do our walkthroughs actually, do we see that what we talked about in that flipped faculty meeting is actually playing out in classrooms? In our walkthroughs, if we're providing feedback to teachers, are we seeing that in our walkthroughs that feedback is being taken into consideration and teachers are using it? If we're doing observations, are we looking back at our old observations to say, I actually gave feedback or I gave praise? That's evidence of implementation, and it doesn't have to be so hard. Sometimes people look at evidence and they think it's difficult. It's really not. Now, I know that I flew through, and I want to thank you for being a part of this. My email address is up here so you can actually ask me follow-up questions. I have not checked Twitter yet, so I will check it. So if you're watching this live and you tweet it out, I'll check that a little bit later. If you're watching this virtually, I'll pay attention to your tweets. But what I'm asking is that the last one is to a SurveyMonkey, and it has a list of questions. There are about 20 of them, and it'll take you about 30 to 35 minutes to fill out. And I'm hoping that some of you will actually fill out the SurveyMonkey because it's helping me with research that I'm actually doing. What Honor says is that today's session is being recorded and can be downloaded from the National Principals Month website. And I just want to thank all of you for being a part of this. And if you have any questions, there are many different formats you can use. Happy National Principals Month. I love the fact that you're in a principal's position. It is one of the greatest positions I ever had. I hope you have a great month and a great school year. Thank you for your time.
Peter, I thank you on behalf of NAESP and our board. We're so thankful for everything you've done and shared today. Many thanks to everyone else who's participated today. Again, he's said where you can download the presentation and our recording. And as always, if NAESP can assist you in your professional learning journey, please reach out to us. We'd love to help you. Please join us for next week's webinar Wednesday on the principal's role in social emotional learning. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
All right.